So there I was, Commander Jake Sullivan, floating around Space Station Nexus Prime, wondering how exactly my life had gone so spectacularly off the rails that I'd become humanity's official representative at something called the Grand Galactic Strategy Tournament. And let me tell you, when the paperwork says grand and galactic in the same sentence, you know you're in for a special kind of headache. The station itself was impressive enough, if you're into that whole gleaming chrome and impossible architecture thing that aliens seem to love. Think of the biggest mall you've ever seen, then imagine it was designed by someone who'd never heard of gravity and had a serious addiction to geometric shapes that shouldn't exist in 3 dimensions. Yeah, that was Nexus Prime. I'm nursing what passes to coffee in this corner of the galaxy, when this pompous official, some kind of crystalline being that sounds like wind chimes, having an argument, approaches me with a datapad. "Commander Sullivan," it chimes, "you are here to represent the Sol system in competition for territorial rights to the Goldilocks sector." "Right," I said, because that's about all the enthusiasm I could muster. "And remind me again why Earth sent a guy whose greatest strategic achievement was winning a poker tournament in Vegas?" The crystal thing doesn't appreciate my humor. The Goldilocks sector contains 17 habitable worlds and the largest deposits of rare minerals in this arm of the galaxy. The winner of today's tournament will claim exclusive mining and colonization rights. Well, that certainly explained why everyone was taking this so seriously. 17 worlds was nothing to sneeze at, even if you had to share the galaxy with beings who thought naming a strategy game Nexus Conquest was the height of creativity. Speaking of which, I'd finally gotten a look at this supposedly impossible game that was going to determine humanity's future. Picture 4D chess, if 4D chess had been invented by someone with a serious grudge against human sanity. The board existed in what my briefing materials helpfully called multi-dimensional space, with pieces that could move through time as well as the usual 3 dimensions. Each player controlled armies that could attack positions that hadn't happened yet, or defend locations that used to exist. "Fascinating," I muttered, which was my polite way of saying, what kind of cosmic joke is this? The real entertainment, though, was meeting my competition. General Krex from the Vorthan Empire, a 7-foot-tall insectoid who looked like a praying mantis, had gotten into a fight with a suit of medieval armor and lost. Professor Quinn, representing the Zentari Collective, who appeared to be made entirely of shifting geometric patterns and spoke exclusively in mathematical equations. And finally, Elder Wisp of the Ethereal Conclave, a floating cloud of what I could only describe as sentient mist with attitude. These 3 had spent the better part of the morning explaining to anyone who'd listened why this tournament was really just a formality, and how they were mostly here to see which of them would win. Humanity, they seemed to agree, was participating out of some kind of cosmic politeness. How thoughtful of them. Let me paint you a picture of my esteemed competition because, honestly, you couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. First up, General Krex, who had apparently spent the last 30 years studying every conceivable variation of Nexus Conquest. And I mean every variation. This guy had memorized opening strategies that took most species 6 months to understand, middle game tactics that required a doctorate in multidimensional mathematics, and endgame scenarios that philosophers wrote dissertations about. He stood there, polishing his carapace and muttering calculations under his breath like some kind of strategic Rain Man. "The probability matrices for Sector 7 displacement create a cascade effect," he'd announced to no one in particular, "leading to inevitable temporal positioning advantages in moves 47 through 63. Yeah, Krex was definitely the type who'd studied so hard he'd forgotten how to have fun, or think outside the box, or, recognize when someone was hustling him. Then there was Professor Quinn, who I'm pretty sure had replaced whatever passed for a brain in his species with a quantum computer. Every sentence out of his mouth sounded like he was reading from a statistics textbook. "Current probability of Vorthan victory stands at 37.4%, he'd announce, his geometric patterns shifting colors. Ethereal success probability calculated at 28.9%. Zentari optimal outcome probability remains at 33.6%. I noticed he didn't bother calculating humanity's chances. Either his computer had broken or our odds were so low they weren't worth mentioning. My money was on the latter. The real character, though, was Elder Wisp. This ancient gas cloud had been floating around the galaxy since before humans figured out fire, and he had the attitude to prove it. Everything was cosmic destiny this, and universal harmonies that. He spoke like he was channeling the secrets of the universe, when really he was just an old fogey who'd gotten lucky a few times. "The patterns reveal themselves to those who seek the deeper truths," he'd whisper in that ethereal voice that sounded like someone talking through a fan. Victory flows to those aligned with the cosmic currents. Right, cosmic currents, because that's definitely how strategy games work. Now, about Nexus Conquest itself. Picture the most complicated board game you've ever seen, then multiply that by the square root of insanity. The game board existed in 4 dimensions, which meant pieces could move through time as well as space. You could attack an opponent's position from last Tuesday, or defend against an assault that wouldn't happen until next Thursday. The goal was simple enough. Control the central nexus points while maintaining your dimensional anchors. Easy, right? Except each nexus point existed across multiple time streams, and controlling one in the present didn't guarantee you'd keep it in the past, and losing one in the future could retroactively destroy your current position. Most games took anywhere from 6 to 18 hours to complete. The record for fastest victory was held by some Zentari prodigy who'd managed it in 4 hours and 37 minutes. That was considered impossibly fast. The human will require extensive tutorial assistance, General Krex announced helpfully. Perhaps we should postpone the tournament until next cycle to allow for proper education. Statistical analysis suggests human comprehension rates will require minimum 47.3 hours of instruction, Professor Quinn added, his patterns flickering with what I assumed was computational smugness. Elder Wisp just chuckled, a sound like wind through cosmic debris. The young species learns much from observing. Patience teaches wisdom. Young species, right, because apparently when you're made of gas and older than dirt, everything else counts as young. The tournament officials, a collection of various aliens who took themselves way too seriously, spent 20 minutes explaining rules I already understood while speaking to me like I was a particularly slow child. They covered basic piece movement, dimensional shifting protocols, temporal anchor management, and nexus point control mechanics, with the kind of patience usually reserved for teaching puppies not to chew furniture. All the while, my 3 opponents watched with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. They'd clearly already written me off as a warm-up act before the real competition began, which was exactly where I wanted them. You know what's beautiful about being underestimated? It's like getting a free invisibility cloak in a world where everyone's looking right through you anyway. Perhaps, General Krex suggested with what I'm sure he thought was kindness, the human would prefer to observe this cycle and participate when better prepared. Professor Quinn's patterns shifted to what looked like a mathematical shrug. Probability of human victory currently calculates at 0.003%. Statistical margin of error exceeds actual chances. Even Elder Wisp got in on the act. Wisdom often comes through witnessing before doing, young traveler from the small blue world. Small blue world. I was really starting to appreciate the creative ways these guys found to be condescending. That's very thoughtful, I said, putting on my best confused human out-of-his-depth voice. But Earth went through a lot of trouble to get me here. Wouldn't want to disappoint the folks back home. What I didn't mention was exactly why Earth had sent me. See, my official title was Commander Jake Sullivan, Strategic Operations, but what that really meant was that I was the guy they called when conventional thinking wasn't working. My military record was less by-the-book brilliance and more whatever works improvisation. Before joining the Space Force, I'd made a living playing poker in Vegas. Not the glamorous tournament circuit stuff, but the real deal. Backroom games where reading people mattered more than memorizing odds tables. After that, I'd spent a few years as a military strategist, the kind they brought in when the textbook solutions weren't cutting it. And before all that, well, let's just say I'd spent my teenage years in arcade halls, mastering every puzzle game, strategy sim, and pattern recognition challenge that Silicon Valley could dream up. Turns out, when you grow up poor and smart, you get really good at finding angles other people miss. But these aliens didn't need to know any of that. The temporal mechanics alone, one of the tournament officials explained for the 3rd time, require careful consideration of causality loops. When you move a piece through time, you must account for the ripple effects on your own past and future positions. Right, I nodded seriously. Time stuff. Got it. General Krex's antennae twitched with what I was learning to recognize as barely contained exasperation. Perhaps a practice round would help the human understand the complexity involved. Oh, I'm sure I'll pick it up as we go, I said. I mean, how complicated can it really be? The silence that followed was the kind you usually hear right before someone explains exactly how complicated it can really be. Professor Quinn's patterns actually stopped shifting for a moment, which I took as the mathematical equivalent of a jaw drop. Commander Sullivan, the crystalline official chimed in, sounding like wind chimes having a migraine. This is the most sophisticated strategy game in known galactic civilization. Masters of Nexus Conquest study for decades before attempting tournament-level play. Decades? Wow. I scratched my head like I was really trying to process this information. Well, I guess Earth humans are just different. We tend to jump in with both feet and figure things out along the way. Elder Wisp's misty form rippled with what might have been amusement. The cosmic forces appreciate boldness, but they also demand respect. Absolutely, I agreed. Respect. Very important. What was really important was that all three of my opponents were now completely convinced I was going to embarrass myself, and by extension, the entire human species. They'd moved from seeing me as competition to viewing me as a mildly entertaining sideshow. General Krex had actually started explaining basic strategy concepts to other spectators, as if he was already planning his victory speech. Professor Quinn was running probability calculations for a two-player tournament, having apparently written me off entirely. And Elder Wisp was floating there looking sage and knowing, probably composing cosmic wisdom about the folly of unprepared youth. The galactic media was eating it up too. I could see reporters from a dozen different species taking notes about Earth's charmingly naive approach to interstellar diplomacy. There were probably betting pools running on how quickly I'd concede. Perfect. Because while everyone was busy being amazed by human ignorance, I was doing what I did best. Watching, listening, and figuring out exactly how this game really worked. And more importantly, how these specific players thought it worked. See, the thing about being really smart, sometimes you can think yourself right out of the obvious answer. The tournament began with all the pomp and circumstance you'd expect from a galactic event that could reshape the political map of this corner of the universe. Holographic banners flickered in languages I couldn't pronounce. Dignitaries from 17 different species filled the observation galleries, and somewhere a choir of crystalline beings was humming what I assumed was the Nexus Prime anthem. The game board materialized in the center of the arena, a shimmering construct of light and force fields that existed in more dimensions than my human brain was technically equipped to process. It looked like someone had taken a chessboard, fed it through a blender with a Rubik's Cube and a physics textbook, then scattered the pieces across time and space just for fun. "Contestants, take your positions," announced the head official, a being that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a filing cabinet. I settled into what the aliens optimistically called a neural interface chair, which basically meant I got to sit in something that felt like it was reading my mind while I tried to move pieces through the fourth dimension. The other three took their positions with practiced confidence. General Krex's carapace gleamed under the arena lights. Professor Quinn's geometric patterns cycled through what I was learning to recognize as his maximum processing power configuration. Elder Wisp just floated there, looking mysteriously ancient and probably calculating cosmic probabilities or whatever it was gas clouds did for fun. "The tournament for control of the Goldilocks sector begins now," the official declared, and suddenly the board was alive with possibility. In Nexus Conquest, the opening moves are traditionally cautious. Players spend the first hour or so establishing their dimensional anchors, securing temporal footholds, and generally making sure they don't accidentally erase themselves from the timeline. It's all very sensible and strategic. Which is why, when it was my turn to move, I did something that made half the audience gasp and the other half start frantically checking their translation protocols. I grabbed my primary assault piece, a chunky bit of holographic military hardware that controlled 3 temporal vectors, and dropped it right into what any first-year student would recognize as a classic trap position. We're talking textbook vulnerable, the kind of move that gets used in tutorials to explain why you should think before you act. The reaction was immediate. General Krex's antennae perked up with barely concealed delight. Professor Quinn's patterns shifted to what I was pretty sure was the mathematical equivalent of a smirk. Even Elder Wisp's misty form rippled with what might have been amusement. Statistical probability of human error was predicted at 94.7%, Professor Quinn announced to no one in particular. Actual result aligns with projections. From the observation gallery, I could hear what sounded like a dozen different species' versions of polite laughter. The crystalline reporter from Galactic News Network was practically vibrating with excitement, probably already composing the headline. Human representative makes predicted blunder in opening move. But here's the thing about appearing to make rookie mistakes. It's only actually a mistake if you don't have a plan. See, that vulnerable position I'd just taken? It was vulnerable to exactly one type of attack, and that attack could only come from someone who thought they were smarter than they actually were. More importantly, it required my opponent to commit their heavy pieces to a specific temporal vector to pull it off. I sat back in my neural interface chair and waited to see who would take the bait. It was General Krex, of course. Military minds love a good tactical opportunity, especially when it confirms their suspicions about enemy competence. 20 minutes later, after Krex had repositioned half his army to exploit my mistake, it was my turn again. This time, I did something that made Professor Quinn actually stop calculating for a moment. I moved a minor support piece to a seemingly random position in what I'll call the temporal backfield, a section of the fourth-dimensional board that most players use for long-term strategic development. It wasn't threatening anything, wasn't defending anything, and appeared to serve no purpose whatsoever in the current game state. Fascinating, Elder Wisp murmured, his gaseous form shifting colors. The human's move exists outside conventional pattern recognition. Professor Quinn's geometric patterns were cycling frantically now, running probability calculations on what appeared to be a completely nonsensical play. No statistical model accounts for this placement, he announced, sounding genuinely puzzled for the first time since I'd met him. Calculating alternative strategic frameworks. But General Krex wasn't worried. He was probably figuring that 2 random moves from the primitive human just meant an easier victory for the superior Vorthon tactical genius. He made his counter-move with confidence, bringing more pieces into play, and setting up what he clearly thought would be a devastating multi-dimensional assault. The audience was getting restless. Galactic strategy tournaments weren't supposed to feature random moves and apparent blunders. They were supposed to be elegant demonstrations of superior intellect, with each move building logically on the last in an intricate dance of 4-dimensional chess mastery. Instead, they were watching what looked like a complete amateur stumble around the board, while 3 galactic champions tried to figure out whether I was playing a game they didn't recognize, or just having some kind of neural interface malfunction. Elder Wisp made his move next, a typically mystical maneuver that involved shifting 3 pieces simultaneously across 2 time streams. Show off. Then Professor Quinn, who spent so long calculating optimal positioning that I actually dozed off in my chair. When I woke up, he'd moved a single piece exactly 1 space forward, apparently after determining that this was the statistically optimal play given current board conditions. My turn again. Here's where it gets fun. I looked at the board, which by now resembled something a mathematician might see during a really bad acid trip. Pieces scattered across 4 dimensions. Temporal vectors creating possibilities that existed in 17 different potential futures, and 3 galactic masterminds who'd spent the last hour positioning themselves for what they thought would be an easy victory over the confused human. Then I made my third move. I took that random support piece from move 2 and shifted it exactly 1 temporal vector forward, placing it in what looked like another completely pointless position. Simultaneously, I activated a dimensional cascade effect that had been building since my very first mistake. The change wasn't immediately obvious. For about 10 seconds, the board looked basically the same, and I could see my opponents starting to plan their next moves. Then the cascade hit. General Krex's carefully positioned assault formation, the one he'd been building around my supposedly vulnerable opening move, suddenly found itself attacking positions that were no longer there. Worse, the temporal displacement had created a feedback loop that was systematically dismantling his entire defensive structure. Professor Quinn's mathematically optimal positioning turned out to be optimal for a game state that had just stopped existing. His probability calculations hadn't accounted for someone who could change the fundamental parameters of the strategic landscape, because statistically speaking, nobody was supposed to be able to do that in 3 moves. And Elder Wisp? Well, all that cosmic wisdom had led him to build a beautiful, mystically balanced formation that was now perfectly positioned to be destroyed by the cascading collapse of his opponent's strategies. The silence in the arena was deafening. Then the board's AI announced in its neutral, computerized voice, "Simultaneous checkmate achieved, all opposing players eliminated, victory to Sol System Representative." You could have heard a pin drop, if pins existed in 4 dimensions and could make noise, while falling through time. General Krex stared at the board like it had personally insulted his ancestors. Professor Quinn's patterns had frozen in what I could only assume was the mathematical equivalent of a blue screen of death. Elder Wisp's gaseous form was shifting colors so rapidly, it looked like a cosmic lava lamp having a seizure. In the observation galleries, approximately 2,000 beings from across the galaxy sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The human, the primitive representative from the small blue world, had just solved what they called an unsolvable strategy puzzle. In 3 moves. and he was grinning like he'd just won a poker game with a pair of twos. Because, in a way, that's exactly what had just happened. The silence stretched on for what felt like about 3 geological epochs, broken only by the gentle hum of the station's life support systems, and what sounded suspiciously like someone in the observation gallery having a nervous breakdown in a language that consisted entirely of harmonic frequencies. Finally, General Krex found his voice, though it came out as more of a strangled whistle than actual words. "Impossible," he managed. "The statistical probability of achieving simultaneous multidimensional checkmate in 3 moves approaches mathematical impossibility. I have studied every known opening sequence, every tactical framework, every strategic paradigm, developed across 4,000 years of galactic civilization." "Yeah," I said, leaning back in my neural interface chair with what I hoped was casual confidence. "That's kind of the problem right there." Professor Quinn's geometric patterns were cycling through colors I was pretty sure didn't exist in normal space. Demand explanation. Human strategy does not compute within established mathematical frameworks. Probability calculations produce error cascades. Elder Wisp, meanwhile, had gone completely transparent, which I was starting to suspect was the gaseous equivalent of fainting. When he finally solidified enough to speak, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect, if respect sounded like wind through a cosmic graveyard. "The patterns," he whispered. "They were there all along. How did we not see them?" The tournament officials were huddled around their monitoring equipment like mechanics trying to figure out why the engine had just spontaneously turned into a butterfly. The crystalline head judge approached my position with what I assumed was extreme caution. "Commander Sullivan," it chimed, though the sound was significantly less melodious than before. "The galactic audience requires clarification of your strategic methodology." I looked around the arena, taking in the sea of confused alien faces, the reporters frantically trying to update their stories, and my 3 opponents who looked like they'd just watched someone solve calculus by coloring outside the lines. "Right," I said, standing up and cracking my knuckles. "Let me break this down for you." I gestured toward the now dissolved game board, where ghostly echoes of the match still flickered in the arena's holographic replay system. "First thing you need to understand is that you were all playing the wrong game. You were playing Nexus Conquest, this incredibly sophisticated 4-dimensional strategy simulation that requires decades of study and mathematical precision." General Krex's antennae twitched irritably. "That is correct. It is the most complex strategy game in known civilization." "Sure," I nodded, "but I wasn't playing Nexus Conquest. I was playing poker." The confused silence that followed was so profound, I could practically hear brain cells dying across 17 different species. Poker? Professor Quinn's patterns had shifted to what looked like a question mark having an existential crisis. "Primitive Earth gambling simulation bears no resemblance to multidimensional strategic frameworks." "See, that's where you're wrong," I continued, warming to my theme. "Poker isn't about the cards, it's about the players. And the first rule of poker is that if you can't spot the sucker at the table, you're the sucker." I pointed to General Krex. "You, my insectoid friend, were playing the game you'd studied for 30 years. Every move you made was textbook perfect, which meant every move you made was completely predictable. When I put my piece in that vulnerable position, you couldn't help yourself. Military minds see tactical opportunities, and they take them, even when those opportunities were obviously bait." Krex's carapace actually darkened with what I assumed was embarrassment. "The positioning was mathematically optimal for exploitation." "Exactly. You saw what you expected to see, and you reacted exactly how I knew you'd react." I turned to Professor Quinn. "And you, my geometrically gifted friend, were playing mathematics. Every calculation was perfect, every probability assessment was accurate, and every strategic decision was optimized for maximum efficiency within known parameters." "Correct," Quinn replied stiffly. "Mathematical optimization ensures superior outcomes." "Right, except I wasn't operating within known parameters. I was making up new ones. That random second move? It wasn't random. It was a setup for a cascade effect that your probability calculations couldn't account for. Because, mathematically speaking, it shouldn't have been possible." The patterns on Quinn's form were cycling so rapidly now that looking at him was giving me a headache. "But the statistical models clearly demonstrate that such cascades require minimum 15 move preparation sequences." "Only if you're thinking inside the mathematical box," I grinned. "But humans are really, really good at thinking outside boxes. Sometimes we don't even know there was a box to begin with." Finally, I turned to Elder Wisp, who had managed to solidify into something approaching his normal misty density. And you, my ancient and gaseous sage, were playing cosmic philosophy. Every move was part of some grand mystical pattern. Every decision was guided by universal harmonies and celestial wisdom. The cosmic currents do guide those who listen, Wisp said defensively. Sure they do, but here's the thing about cosmic wisdom. It assumes the universe makes sense. And sometimes the best strategy is to do something that doesn't make sense until it's too late for anyone to stop it. I walked over to where the holographic replay was showing the final moments of the match, the cascade effect rippling through 4 dimensions like dominoes falling through time. See, you all made the same fundamental mistake. You assumed that because I was human, I'd play by human rules. Primitive, simple, probably based on violence and random chance. But humans don't just have one way of thinking. We're the species that invented poker and chess and risk and 3-dimensional tic-tac-toe and about 17 different ways to make war into a game. I gestured around the arena, where the audience was hanging on every word. My first move was risk. Take territory, look vulnerable, draw your opponents into overcommitting. My second move was pure 3-dimensional chess, setting up a position that wouldn't pay off until several moves later. And my third move? That was poker. I bet everything on a bluff that turned out not to be a bluff at all. General Krex was slowly shaking his head, his antennae drooping with what looked suspiciously like defeat. But the complexity analysis, the multidimensional calculations, the temporal vector management— Yeah, about that, I interrupted. You know what's funny about really complex problems? Sometimes the solution isn't more complexity. Sometimes it's just doing something simple in a way nobody expects. Professor Quinn had gone completely still, his patterns frozen in what appeared to be the mathematical equivalent of deep contemplation. Human approaches to problem-solving operate outside established logical frameworks. Not outside logic, I corrected. Just outside your logic. Humans have been solving unsolvable problems for thousands of years, usually by ignoring the part that makes them unsolvable. Elder Wisp's form rippled with what might have been cosmic laughter. The young species teaches the old ones new patterns. Perhaps there is wisdom in chaos after all. The head tournament official had been listening to this exchange with what I assumed was growing horror. When I finished explaining, it approached with the kind of careful movements usually reserved for handling unstable explosives. Commander Sullivan, it chimed hesitantly, are you suggesting that human strategic thinking is fundamentally incompatible with established galactic methodologies? I thought about that for a moment, looking out at an arena full of aliens who were probably going to need therapy after watching their worldview get demolished in 3 moves. Not incompatible, I said finally. Just different. You all play to win perfectly. Humans play to win, period. And sometimes, winning ugly is still winning. The silence that followed wasn't confused this time. It was thoughtful, like the sound of several thousand incredibly intelligent beings simultaneously reconsidering everything they thought they knew about strategy, complexity, and the surprising effectiveness of controlled chaos. And in the middle of it all, I was trying very hard not to laugh at the fact that I'd just accidentally become humanity's unofficial ambassador to a galaxy that was about to discover what happened when you gave humans 17 worlds to play with. This was going to be fun. The crystalline head official was still processing what had just happened, its harmonic voice crackling with what I was pretty sure was the interstellar equivalent of bureaucratic panic. Commander Sullivan, it chimed, though the melody was distinctly off-key now. By the terms of the Grand Galactic Strategy Tournament, the Sol System hereby claims territorial and mining rights to the Goldilocks sector, including all 17 habitable worlds and associated mineral deposits. Fantastic, I said, trying to sound like I won intergalactic real estate every day. I'll make sure to send Earth a postcard from our new vacation planets. The official's crystalline structure flickered nervously. There will, of course, be extensive paperwork. Territorial transfer protocols, mining consortium agreements, diplomatic integration frameworks. Sure thing, I waved dismissively. Just email it to me. Or whatever you use instead of email. Quantum entanglement it. Send it by space pigeon, I don't care. Earth's got lawyers who specialize in reading fine print in languages that don't exist yet. From the observation galleries came what sounded like several different species' versions of nervous laughter. I was starting to get the impression that the galaxy had never quite dealt with someone who treated winning 17 worlds like winning a particularly good hand at poker. General Krex approached with the careful dignity of someone whose entire worldview had just been reorganized by a sledgehammer. Commander Sullivan, he said formally, the Vorthan Empire would like to request a strategic consultation. A what now? Your methodology, he explained, his antenna twitching with barely contained fascination. It operates outside conventional tactical frameworks. We believe there may be applications to military scenarios we have not previously considered. Professor Quinn's geometric patterns had stabilized into what looked like intense curiosity. The Zentari collective seconds this request. Human problem-solving approaches require further study. Statistical models must be updated to account for non-logical solution pathways. Even Elder Wisp was floating closer, his misty form rippling with what might have been excitement. The cosmic patterns speak of new wisdom from unexpected sources. Perhaps the young species has gifts that age has forgotten. I looked around at these three representatives of ancient galactic civilizations, each of them basically asking me to teach them how to think like humans. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a plasma torch. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. You want to learn how to be illogical? Not illogical, Krex corrected quickly. Alternatively logical. Your strategic approaches follow patterns we did not recognize as patterns. Chaos theory applications, Professor Quinn added, his patterns brightening. Complexity mathematics suggests human methodology operates within fractal solution spaces. The cosmic dance includes steps we have not learned, Wisp concluded mysteriously. I had to laugh. Here I was, a guy whose biggest qualification was winning a poker tournament in Vegas, and suddenly I was the galaxy's hot new strategic consultant. You know what? I said, feeling that familiar entrepreneurial itch that had gotten me into trouble more times than I could count. I think I can work with this. How about we set up some kind of cultural exchange program? Earth sends you a few dozen poker players, chess masters, and arcade champions. You teach us about multidimensional mathematics and temporal mechanics. Everybody wins. The aliens exchanged what I assumed were meaningful looks, though with beings made of gas, geometry, and chitin it was hard to tell. This could be acceptable, General Krex said carefully. Strategic diversity strengthens overall tactical capabilities. Economic models suggest mutual benefit optimization, Professor Quinn agreed, though his patterns were cycling through what looked suspiciously like excitement. Elder Wisp just chuckled, that cosmic wind-through debris sound that was starting to grow on me. The universe expands through learning, new patterns enrich the eternal dance. As I watched these three representatives of incredibly advanced civilizations get genuinely excited about learning human-style organized chaos, I couldn't help but think about how this whole thing had started. Earth had sent me here, expecting me to embarrass humanity on an interstellar stage. Instead, I'd accidentally opened up what was probably going to be the most interesting cultural exchange program in galactic history. The tournament officials were still scrambling around, trying to figure out how to explain to their superiors that the primitive humans had not only won the most important strategy competition in this arm of the galaxy, but had done it using methods that apparently didn't exist in any of their textbooks. The galactic media was having a field day. I could see reporters from a dozen different species frantically updating their stories, probably trying to figure out how to explain human strategic thinking to audiences that had never heard of poker, bluffing, or the general concept of winning through controlled unpredictability. As for me, I was already planning my next move. 17 worlds was a pretty good starting point, but the galaxy was a big place, and there were probably a lot more unsolvable problems out there just waiting for someone to ignore the part that made them unsolvable. So, I said to my new alien friends, anybody know where I can get a decent cup of coffee around here, because I've got a feeling we're going to be up late planning humanity's next impossible victory. The laughter that followed came from creatures made of mist, mathematics, and military precision, and it sounded like the beginning of something that was going to make the next few decades very, very interesting. After all, the universe had spent billions of years developing sophisticated, logical, perfectly reasonable approaches to complex problems. And then humans had shown up. Honestly, I almost felt sorry for the universe. Almost. But not really. Because as I'd just demonstrated, sometimes the best solution to an impossible problem is to be the kind of species that doesn't believe in impossible. And if that wasn't worth 17 new worlds, and a galaxy full of new friends, I didn't know what was. Game over. Humans win. Again.